It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Adrienne Keane. Dr. Keane is an associate professor in urban and regional planning at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. I've had a delightful time getting to know her over the course of this week, and I'm so pleased that she's traveling so far to bring her wisdom to share with us. She has a background in local government, working in environmental health and then in urban planning. She has also worked with a community including Clean Up the World, Australia's largest participatory event, and Clean Up the World projects, which I'm very curious about. As a practitioner turned academic, Dr. Keane enjoys teaching strategic planning and urban ecology for planners and urban designers. She authored the book Understanding Urbanism, which was published in 2020. She's a member of the Urban Specialist Group, part of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Urban Areas, or Protected Areas, an associate member of the Planning Institute of Australia, a board member of the International Urban Planning and Environmental Association, the community representative president of the Observatory Hill Environmental Education Centre of the New South Wales Department of Education. She brings research interests, including planning practice, biodiversity in cities, as well as a passion to understand how planning education can best support graduates for their future. And she's interviewed us, many of us faculty, while visiting here doing research in that area. Today, she's going to be speaking about koalas and stupid planning. And I'm hoping in the insights that she will bring and share about planning education that we can have more of the koalas and less of the stupid planning. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Keane.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. That's a very generous welcome. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Adrienne, and I want to take this opportunity to say that I'm absolutely quite fortunate to be sharing some of the stuff I've been doing with you guys, and really happy to have a chat after. So get those questions lined up. So I'm going to talk about koalas and stupid planning, and during the lecture I will actually try and work out what stupid is, and you guys can help me if you like. But before I don't think it's going to do its thing. No, it's not. Maybe I'm too far. I might have to do it manually. I can do that. Bit of a delay. We can do that. I'd also like to, thank you, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country that we're on. We do a similar thing at home too. And the University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadi people, part of the Eora Nation. And how we do an acknowledgement of country, we also say that we pay respects to their ancestors, past, present and emerging. So I'm really pleased that I've been able to acknowledge the traditional owners here too. Aha, have to be a bit closer. All right, so a bit of a geography. Who's been to Australia, by the way? Anyone been? Yeah, a few people? Okay, so we're way down there. You know, they call us the land down under. I don't know, I think that was a song once. But it was a really fantastic trip across up into New York State. It only took three flights, so that was okay. Australia is a very large continent, and I just put it on top of the US, not to be disrespectful, but just to give you a bit of relativity there. 85% of Australians live around the coast, right? So we're lovely and fertile and green and wet and pleasant, mostly around there. It's the driest inhabited continent in the world, right? Antarctica, I think, is actually the driest continent. We've got 10 deserts, but a great deal of biodiversity. We've got 700,000 different species of living organisms, and according to the scientists who always know more than planners, we probably have as much again in terms of things that we haven't yet found. So it's a very old continent. We have the biggest array of marsupial mammals, which is one of them I'm going to talk about today. And unfortunately, we've had the highest rate of mammal extinction across the world. We're not really proud of that. But I think that has a lot to do with life after colonisation and the way we've treated land. So before that, with our, excuse me, just a frog in my throat. Before that, of course, the Indigenous people who have come to Australia and lived in Australia for over 60,000 years. It's estimated at least 60,000 years, and they actually are the longest living culture in the one place in the world. And they lived and worked with the environment. But when we colonised it in the end of the 1700s, we brought all the practices from England with us and ripped out all the trees and dug up all the land and did all that damage. I guess there can be similar histories with the US, right? So we run through and we get state of environment reports every 5 years, and we know that our biodiversity is in decline. And since in the 5 years since the latest report, actually that about diversity and conservation, we're not doing very well at all in terms of decreasing the rate of loss. So even the threatened species are increasing, and of course the major drivers are the same drivers that we would find elsewhere. So climate change is a problem, but it's a habitat loss and degradation really that's probably the largest driver for these things, because the extensive change to land. And when you remove trees and change the land, then you get wonderful things like invasive species for plants, but also animals, and they do a lot of damage. So recently we had ginormous bushfires, we say bushfires, in Australia, and we lost about 3 billion, estimated 3 billion animals across the country. That's a lot of animals, right? So it's a bit tough. But this is where I start thinking about stupid planning. So recently there's been a review of the national and it's been criticised because it's not effective in delivering improved outcomes for biodiversity. So it's a bit of an irony that you have an act called the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, when actually what it's doing is not helping its own objectives. So before I jump into my case study and also talk to you about koalas, I just thought I'd give this very, I stole this actually from the Australian government. It's part of a public education thing, just to explain that Australia is a federated nation, like the US. So we have, we also call it the Commonwealth, because our country is called the Commonwealth of Australia. And so it has its own constitution, which enables the government to do certain things, but actually limits them as well. So if it's not in the constitution, the Commonwealth can't do things. So I'm a planner, I'm interested in planning, so I can tell you that land use planning is not in the constitution. So directly, the national government has nothing to do with planning and planning decisions. But it does have a couple of other mechanisms it can use in the constitution. And one of them is that the Australian government can sign international conventions, right? And so if they can sign a convention, World Heritage Convention, Convention on Biodiversity, anything at all, then they have a right under the Constitution to operationalise it. So something like Ramsar, Convention on Biodiversity, etc., needed to be operationalised, and so they wrote that act, the EPBC Act, because that would help them be able to have their responsibilities under the treaty. But all the power, a lot of the power about land use planning, stays with the states. So those areas of Australia were really there before the nation became a nation in 1901, and so they had all their fingers in land, because if you've got control of land, you've really got control of resources and money and all that sort of stuff. So they weren't going to give up those powers to the national government. So most land use planning decisions, except for things like airports and seaports and defence lands, all falls to the state. Excuse me. And then we have local councils. And local councils are not independent governments either. They are actually created by their relevant state government. And all those little dots there are to show the seat of power, if you like. So for the nation, that yellow dot's supposed to be Canberra. So, and you can see we've got a lot of local governments around Australia, but reflective of where the population is. So there's a lot of cute photos. Just going to tell you a little about like little soft, fluffy things. So why am I interested in koalas? I'm not interested in them because they're cute and cuddly, because they can be a bit smelly and they growl. Did you know that? They growl. Anyway. The deterioration of our biodiversity. And because they're quite unique, they're quite particular in their needs for certain ecology, because they only eat eucalyptus leaves, which are those beautiful leaves at the top there. They're highly dependent on their environment. They don't adapt. So that's why they're an interesting case to understand. So because they eat a lot of eucalyptus leaves, they do a lot of this activity on the left. So often when you see koalas, they're just snoring their heads off a lot, right? So, because they have to digest it all. The other reason it's good to think about koalas is, well, they are iconic. You know, they're really, they're not koala bears, by the way. If you ever heard, they're not a bear at all. They're a marsupial, right? So we used to call them koala bears when I was a kid, but they're not a bear. They're a marsupial. But they are unique. They're unique to Australia and certain parts of Australia. And as I say there, they're one step away from extinction. So when the terrible fires hit, we lost a lot of land that is koala habitat, right? Which is not all of Australia. It's only in certain areas. So when you lose 3.5 million hectares of koala habitat, you really put this animal into more vulnerable conditions. And in fact, because of that decline and loss of some of the population in New South Wales, Queensland and the Australian Capital Territory, the Commonwealth Government decided to change its listing from a vulnerable species to a threatened species, endangered species. And that's like the step before extinction. So we're very, very close to that for koalas in Australia. So here this is where they live. So all down the east coast, so Queensland, and there's New South Wales and Victoria, and off to going towards the west is South Australia. They're pretty, what was I going to say? So there's different ecologies that they can live in, but they are just the one species, but they have adapted to local conditions wherever they are, but they're still very much dependent on the trees that they eat. Now, you recall I said 85% of Australians live on the coast, right? So if we have a look where koalas live, that's exactly where we are too. And that's exactly where we're growing our cities and regions, etc. So urban expansion is a real problem for koalas. They're subject to a disease called chlamydia. In fact, the case I'm going to talk to you about today is the only colony without that disease, which is great for that one. And the thing that kills them most likely when they're near people is being hit by a car or killed by dogs. The other thing that can happen too is that they drown in backyard pools. So, over the years there's been some work thinking about how do we help with restoring koala habitat, because we need the habitat to look after the koalas. And this is forecasting with changes with the climate change. And you can see with the green receding that the land that's currently there, the environments currently there, they will disappear. I sort of don't like these figures, that image. Not that it's not telling us a really good story about the loss of the habitat, but it actually makes it look like all to get onto Google Earth and you'll actually see that that is not a true corridor all the way around. And the other thing we've got going is we get a lot of fires close by, and the vegetation that animals are often reliant on needs fire so it can reproduce and grow. And so you can have too much fire, which completely kills trees, or you have no fire at all, and then the trees don't grow and they don't regenerate. So we're in this really weird and difficult spot. But what is the problem? What are all the consequences, and how can we sort of unpack them? But I thought before I leapt into that, I'll try to explain myself about what stupid means. So I'm just going to rely on the Merriam-Webster dictionary, because why not? But when I go through the rest of this presentation, you might want to reflect on some of these descriptors here and see whether you recognise any of those in any of the decision making that's happened. Because I know that for me, when I'm reading a lot of things, I certainly feel exasperated, you know. So let's see how we can pick these up as we go through. So the case study I want to share with you is a new development in southwest Sydney called Fig Tree Hill. Fig tree on a hill. So, but it's a lovely photograph. It just shows, you know, like a bucolic look of southwest Sydney. It was an agricultural property. I think originally, it might have been cropping there originally, but definitely sheep and then cows, or cattle, I should say. So here we are in the East Coast. Here's Sydney University is about there. And the properties I'm talking about is just around here, around Campbelltown and Appin. Now you can see with that the layout of Sydney, we are mostly concentrated around, that's where everyone got off the boat at the beginning, right? And most of the concentration of residential stuff is there, and then it follows this line, which is the Parramatta River, up into the spectacular World Heritage Area, which is the Blue Mountains. And we have national parks really boundaring all our cities. So we're incredibly lucky, and there's about 3-something million of us that live in there. And we've got a new train recently. We're all very excited. So in that space, we've got this bit in red here called Mount Gilead, which is the original homestead for the property on which Fig Tree Hill development will happen. It's interesting to note, I think, that it's actually a really ecologically important area, because you've got protected areas here, but you've got the Georges River on one side, and you've got the Nepean River on the other. But as you can see, Sydney is ever going southwest with new subdivisions and motorways and all sorts of things there. This is a little blurb from the developer, who is Lendlease, big developer in Australia, giving us a bit of an idea of what that triangle parcel may look like. And it looks pretty positive there. It's sort of giving an idea that, you know, there'll be a little bit of a residential development, but lots of parkways and things like that, trying to give us an idea of how it might look. Just to give you an idea of the prices. So have to do, that's in Australian dollars, I'm really sorry. So it's about, what's that, 600,000 US. So the median house price in Sydney is 1.6 million, right? So these houses that are out in southwest Sydney, with some of the argument of actually having increasing housing supply, are in places that haven't actually got transport infrastructure and social infrastructure. There's no schools out there yet, etc., etc. As usual, sometimes with planning we allow new communities, but we actually don't put all that infrastructure in there, right? So you guys can come up with that. But you can buy a house, they'll build it for you, or you can buy a piece of land and you can build your own house. That's what you want to do. So they're not cheap. They're not cheap houses. So if we had a quick timeline of all the factors that come into play for doing a change from an agricultural site to a residential site, there's a few things just to keep in the back of your mind. The Darawal people were traditional, or still are the traditional owners of that land, but they lost any use of that land once the farmers moved in, the 1800s. So in the 1970s and actually in the 1960s, that part of Sydney was identified as a future growth zone, right? So it's been on the cards for a very long time that's where we were going to expand. The site itself was actually made up of 4 lots of land between 2 owners, and they had a zoning that wouldn't actually allow the development of their land into residential use. So the process is, if you want to change the zone, then you have to go through application process, right? Which I can talk a little bit about that. But the idea was, if they could get the zoning, instead of having 1 homestead there, they would have 1,700 homes on the site there, and some other facilities. So interestingly, because that site contained environmental values of national significance, all the approvals for a change of a zone and future development on the land needed approval, assessment and approval at both the state level and the national level. So there were 2 pieces of legislation in play. And the first one I want to talk about is the State Planning Act. And now this Planning Act, there's seats down here if you guys want to come in and sit down. You're very welcome. So the Act, when it first came in, I think in 1979, it was actually quite an amazing Act. It was the first time that we'd seen anything that actually took the environment seriously in decision making. And when it was first published, and they used to actually print it out on paper in those days, the Act was really, really thin. Right? It didn't have a lot of words, but it was actually really impactful. Right? It was really clear what you could and couldn't do. And it made decision making easier. Anyway, so the politicians had to go at it, so it's much, much thicker now and far more complex. That's not unusual. But even though it's gone through a number of amendments, it holds these some of these objects still in place. And I think these are very important things to note, because what this Act is meant to be doing is actually getting us to sustainability, thinking about economy, thinking about social issues, thinking about the environment. And in particular, Object E is about protecting the environment, to think about, to ensure the conservation of threatened and other species. Right? It says it there. Right. And that Act gives us provisions about how we go about making strategic plans, how we undertake development, assessment, and who's responsible for that. Okay. So there's a little image on the top right, and that's an old zoning plan. Any planner would recognise a zoning plan, I guess. But this is just to iterate that it was non-urban. The site was zoned non-urban. So for them to do things, they had to go through this whole process. And what we call it in New South Wales is a planning proposal. And the proponents, the two owners, went to the local council, because the council was actually the approval authority under the law, and said, we're really keen to rezone our property so we can build these 1,700 houses and do other things. And council thought that was a great idea, because it was actually in line strategically with the Greater Macarthur strategic plan, everything that they wanted to do, and have more people come and live in the area. So as part of that, council then goes up to the state government, because the state government has an authority over the process to make sure that the process is followed the right way, and they had to provide evidence that it was a good idea. And so they presented evidence, including some ecological considerations, and the state government said, look, yep, okay, I think this is looking good, but you're going to have to do a lot more work. And then what that's called is a gateway approval, which is basically the state government go, yep, this is looking all right, come back with a lot more work, and then we'll give it the yes or no. So it took about 4 years for them to do that bit of work, which is fine. So one of the reports that they did was with urban ecologists who go out on site, and they have a look for threatened species, vulnerable species, really trying to work out what's going there. Now, it is well known in Campbelltown that there is a colony of koalas. So koalas was something that they were looking for. And so off they went, and they investigated a few things, and they found a lot of endangered trees, Cumberland forest trees and shell trees, and I think a lizard who was on the list, you know, quite a few things, you know, these organisms that are hanging on. But the planning instrument that is used to test if koalas are present or not, it's known as the State Environmental Planning Policy 44. Yeah, they always put numbers on them. That's really easy to work out what it's about. And what the ecologists had to look for to see if it was koala habitat was two things. One, were there any koala feed trees there? Right? So remember what I said, they have specific dietary requirements for the eucalypts. But it wasn't if they found one tree or half a tree with a leaf on it. It had to be of all the trees that are on there that 10% were actually, 10% or more were koala feed trees. Now that land, if you remember the photograph, had lost most of its trees because it had been agriculture, right? And there wasn't much there. But there were koala feed trees on there. And the thing is that koalas move a lot. They're really mobile, even though that guy at the front was having a long sleep after eating gums. They actually travel over ground very, very quickly, right? So they can travel a long way to go and find the right tree. But anyway, so they didn't have enough of those trees to say that, you know, that was a feed tree, it had enough feed trees, so not so good. And the other thing is, did they actually see a koala, right? So seeing a koala could mean, you know, finding a scat, you know, a bit of poo, or actually seeing a koala. And they didn't see those things either on that land. They did see it in the adjacent land, but it's actually not part of the survey site. And because they didn't find it on the survey site, it was declared under this this environmental bit of law that koalas did not exist on that site, and therefore koalas should not be considered in terms of any development assessment for that site. And that turns out to be untrue in the end. So the state government, the Commonwealth government gets involved because the ecologists did find other threatened species. And so because of the Constitution and the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Commonwealth government gets involved, and they too do an assessment over the lands, but they're looking for different things. And what it turns out to be is, what they look for is there a way that we could give certification over that land, work out what's there, what needs to be protected for the entire land, and say, right, as far as I'm concerned from the Commonwealth government, even if you do different DAs down the track, you don't ever have to come back to us for approval on anything else you have to do, right, biocertification. And then the other thing was about biodiversity offsets, because the developer wanted to get rid of stands of threatened species trees, right? And they said, yep, gave them a permission to get rid of those trees, including koala feed trees, and instead they could invest their money in putting trees somewhere else, right? I think that's pretty stupid. Anyway, that's my view. So one of the positive things, though, through that process was recognising that because koalas do move, is to look at where, with the development as it goes, can they strengthen the corridor between the Georges River and the Nepean to help koalas move across the land. So to me that's a bit of an irony when one planning thing says, no, officially koalas don't exist, to the next thing of, oh, let's look for opportunities to make sure that those koalas that don't exist can go across the land. Okay, so the Chief Scientist and Engineers report towards the beginning, the panel was very clear and thought that no one was actually talking to each other in any of this assessment, and it was making things very, very difficult and confusing to make good decisions. And then what happened was we had a big fire, those big summer fires. And previously to that, the community at Campbelltown were very upset because they thought this development was very anti-koala. Fair enough. And because of that, the big fire and the loss of so many animals, it was a real tipping point in the discussion around this particular development, what was happening in the southwest of Sydney, so much so that the New South Wales government had a parliamentary inquiry. That was quite extraordinary. And out of that came some good things about how to look after koalas in the future, different strategies and looking at different habitats and establishing different corridors, which is pretty good. But in that inquiry was some very sad information that if we don't change what we do, including how we look after our lands and think about development, we actually won't have any koalas in New South Wales by 2050. And you know, they are the only healthy colony of koalas in the country. So they thought, if we've got to do something, we've got to stop clearing land, we need to establish more national parks. How about we establish the Great Koala National Park, which we're hoping will get launched next year. So it really gave a lot of people a lot of hope that there might be a different approach to how we deal with koalas in Sydney and how we could protect them. And everyone was looking forward to the Great Koala National Park, but it wasn't in Sydney, it was actually up in the mid-coast. And it was part of forestry land, which means it's already owned by the government, right? And what they were trying to do is complete all the logging before it turned into the Great Koala National Park. I don't know, I think that sounds stupid to me too. So telling us one thing but doing another. And the argument was they had to finish logging because they had a contract with forestry to be able to do that. Anyway, it's the ridiculousness things. So getting back to the fig tree development, is the chief scientist's report came back in terms of thinking of how can we integrate some more sort of controls to help the koala there, or in the fact that perhaps there are these weaknesses that we need to address. And they actually weren't addressed, even though you've got the chief scientist and engineer and the panel providing information into the Department of Planning to do something. They did not actually take any of that advice. So one of the things they were talking about, remember I mentioned, dogs and cars aren't good for koalas. So there was absolutely no restrictions given in regards to dogs and cats. Cats aren't good either, right? So whereas I know that there are other communities, and not in Australia, but other communities that have, like caveats over land. So you can't have your cat and a dog, or they have to be, fenced in and on a lead, all those sort of things. That didn't happen in our case. Whereas a recent Land and Environment Court case, which was just 2 weeks ago, they actually have a condition that says for future residents they can't have cats and dogs. And they're doing that actually as a mitigation strategy to protect the koala. The other thing about the Fig Tree Hill development is even though there was no koalas spotted on the land, there is going to be a corridor fenced in to ensure that the koalas can cross that land, right? So it's only about 3 metres wide and it's a fence. It's not fenced all the way because of the topography. Sometimes the fence goes there, but they're actually going to be fenced. Now, and that's supposed to protect them from dogs and people. So I think that's pretty interesting. I think, is that like a new gated community for koalas? I don't know what's going on there, or maybe a new form of zoo. But the fencing is porous and it's narrow, so that's not ideal in terms of how koalas live, or perhaps in terms of its protection. But one of the interesting things that is happening in another part of the New South Wales Government's Planning and Environment Department is the development of this Cumberland Plan Conservation Plan, which is actually about mapping the koala corridor and really working at how through things like overpasses and underpasses there might be opportunities for actually helping the koalas move from one place to another. And so so this is the whole Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan, and our places around here, basically. So what is interesting and perhaps a hopeful sign is that the New South Wales Government is starting to identify sites outside of Sydney, near Sydney, between where Fig Tree Hill is and the Blue Mountains, so it's just part of our city area, and they're ensuring that the zoning cannot be changed from agriculture to residential, and then they would have extra layers of protection over the threatened species that happen to be there. I'm quite hopeful about that. That might work, and with that, hopefully support some of the way koalas move. So this is just from a portal if you're really interested in looking at viewers, and you can get access to that. And so where are we? We're down around here somewhere. So they've got an official koala corridor here, and then somehow bringing together the remnant forests and some new things will actually start looking at how they can actually have some way for the koala to go from east to west. And all this hatching here is all the identified areas that which will not change the zone. So there won't be any residential development. It will be stay in agricultural zoning. I don't know. But that's, you know, politics might change, right? So someone might have another idea. Okay, so how are we going? We're going all right for time? I think we're going all right for time, yeah. So let's have a really, what are the enablers of these problems and what to do about them? Because, you know, it's not a unique case, I think, this bumbling around with land use planning. So we, going to the national legislation, it was reviewed. Its second review since it came online in 1999 by Superman Graham Samuels, who had a look at it and had 10 key findings about it. But basically, he was saying that it doesn't work. The legislation does not work. It's a really interesting read, really, really good. And one of the things that he recommended was there needs to be like an EPA, a national EPA. We've got EPAs at state level, but not an environmental protection agency at Commonwealth level, at national level. But giving them real powers and maybe even the decision-making powers to actually look at some of these developments that would adversely impact our threatened species. So what can this agency do through its decision-making to really contribute to reversing the decline in biodiversity? And we had a new government 18 months ago or something, and they went, yeah, we're going to do stuff about that. And I went, oh, that's really good, you know, there's a boost. But they're probably within just over 12 months for the next national election. And so the conversation, the language, the narrative has changed. So they're saying now, oh, we probably won't have a watchdog. We might just have, you know, some body that just keeps an eye on the legislation. No approval powers. What that means is it just waters down all the hope that we would have read in Samuel's report, because what he was asking for was not, or pointing out, was not being unreasonable. He was pointing out how the environment is actually not taken into consideration really when we're making decisions, and he was telling us about how we can do it in a better way. So we don't think the federal government is really committed to any of those things. So continuing this idea that there's inadequate and contrary legislative provisions, if we have a look at our state government, our New South Wales government, is that I think it's a study of political farce. So I was talked to you about SEP 44 and the ecologists not being able to find a koala poo or not enough trees, and that's enough to say that koalas didn't exist. Well, that SEP number 44 became a hot political potato because, I just love environmental politics sometimes because it's so silly, because the National Party, which country party if you like, saw the mechanism to stop farmers clearing their land, right? So that became a real issue in Parliament. So rather than looking at the SEP and thinking about how it could work in different circumstances, that wasn't going to happen. And also, why isn't it enough that instrument is supposed to be there to save all koalas. Why isn't that enough? But that's not what happened. So they thought, let's try and rewrite it. So they rewrote it in 2029 with the similar hopeful wording about encouraging a conservation and management of areas of natural vegetation, which is great. And it applied to the whole state. But people were really unhappy about that. They were outraged. And then the very next year, it was gone. It was rescinded, that state policy. And instead, we landed up with another policy just for rural zones. So the rules were different. It was easier to chop down trees in the rural zone. And then they thought, oh no, hang on, we better put another one back in for non-rural zones because we forgot to do that before. So then we got this other one in 2021 for things other than rural zones. And you think, oh, well, maybe that's going to be quite, maybe better when we're talking about development in urban areas that are affecting koalas. But it turns out not so. So, there are mechanisms in that instrument that allows the developer to get approval to actually take out all the feed trees. So, and other escape routes, as my colleague Nicole Graham from the School of Law refers to. So it's getting silly. Oh, but we hadn't finished changing those steps. So we decided then to bundle them all up into this ginormous state environmental planning policy with all the other issues in the same document, just different chapters. So whereas before, each of these state environmental planning policies had separate titles and mechanisms, everything was blended. And so what we find is koala habitat protection now is in there somewhere in chapters 2 and 3, protection. So it's getting very difficult, actually, to be able to put your finger on the right bit of legislation. Like, you have to know it's there to know it's there, right? So that's not a really good outcome for the community who are quite on top of these things. So not that fabulous. So what else do I think about inadequate and contrary legislation? All the legislation enables development. There's always going to be a yes to development. There's never going to be a no. So, and that's not a bad thing. You know, development's good. We all benefit from development. But what I'm trying to say is that by always ensuring a yes, you're working really hard through the process, through compromise, to get to the outcome that the proponent wants. And there isn't enough weight to think about what the world might need, or ecology might need, or our ecosystems might need. You know, what's the outcome for the more than human components? Because the more than human components actually support, you know, our way of life. So there's never a no, right? There's never ever a no. And then I've just got the time frame. So I say it as short as I can. So we made a decision in 1960 to do development in the area around Campbelltown in the southwest, right? With all these glorious, wonderful environmental assets still there. We review strategic plans regularly, right? Not once has there ever been any conversation, because I've been doing a bit of history work on this, where anyone said, oh, maybe we shouldn't actually be building out there because it's, flood prone, bushfire prone, it's got all these amazing things like koala. Never once has that happened. And there's been a couple of things to give us a bit of a hint that maybe we should be rethinking. So biodiversity conventions, for example, global warming, or global warning, if you like. All these things have been triggered. But still, planning hasn't been flexible enough or been able to work through the complexities to see how these things could be integrated in a better way. So for me, I think if we recognise that something isn't actually great for our community for all these different reasons, just because we said we were going to do it in 1960, does it matter, why do we keep that same decision, 50 years later? So it never seems to be that thinking. Right. So what does this case suggest? Written by a lawyer, I think. So our strategic decisions have lasting impacts. So it's not a 5-year plan. These are decades-long decisions that we all live with. And so what mechanisms can we introduce? What can we do differently, actually, to be able to address them? So thinking about bushfires, thinking about climate change, and the fact that that land was lost all its tree coverage through agriculture, etc. What options else could there be for that land? And it's not pitting housing against environment or housing against economics, but it's actually thinking about more sustainable approaches to our strategic planning. The other thing is that development first, or development at all costs, really is contrary to actually the objects of the Act. So the legislation and the narrative are all about sustainability, but that's actually not what we're delivering through our practice of development assessment. So I think that's problematic, but it's been problematic for a while. So what are people doing about that? How is the community reacting? What's government doing? What are policy doing? And after the adverse outcomes from the bushfire and the Commonwealth review of their own legislation, there's a lot of narrative about nature first, right? So, but that's still a very vague notion. What they're trying to do is put some weight on the more than human outcomes than they have before. And I'm just a bit cynical about that. Perhaps we can find land now, or I'd be more willing to actually buy out land, take it out of the housing stock area, right? And that is, of course, incredibly fraught because people own that land. They've been land banking for some time. They've got $1 billion coming their way. That's exciting. And then, of course, there is a lot of pressure from the development lobby that is actually pitting the notion of affordable housing or Sydney not having enough housing and blaming planning for that. But I can assure you, I've got no proof at hand, but I can tell you that the approvals that have gone through the planning process, right? There are tens of thousands of approvals, but the developers aren't using them. So there is vacant land and there's potential elsewhere. But maybe we could just buy out some of that line. The policy shift away from expansion into the biosensitive areas, that seems to be happening now with the Cumberland Conservation Plan. So I'm going to be really interested to see how that lives and how it actually secures things over time. And the one thing that we do not do in my country is actually think about the cumulative impact of individual developments. So we don't think at landscape scale when we are assessing everything. We just don't. And there is a complete disconnect by strategic planning that might look over landscape and then what happens at individual lots. So this one at Fig Tree Hill is going to get rid of, some endangered plants, so they can build a house on it. But how many endangered plants are there elsewhere? What's the cost there? And then my cute koala's back. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. we're back there.
Hi, I'm Shreya. Thank you for your lecture. So I just wanted to give a bit of context before I start in. I'm from India, and I could relate a lot to your lecture because while I worked on a project very similar to what you were saying, it's more of a comment, but just like trying to draw parallels between what I see was back in India, we also have a lot of development, mass development happening and the aspect of environment really isn't trickling down to the policy levels. So the project that I worked on was bought out by a developer, and it was a really biosensitive piece of land. And in that piece of land, it was entirely flattened out and then built into these communities. And what I felt could have been a possibility in such a situation was taking into consideration the natural ecosystems of that place and then building an environmental, instead of parks, it could have been the natural processes of nature itself that could have been integrated into the housing societies. And a lot of trees were cut down, and the only trees that could have, that was only retained were the teakwood trees, which were also invasive species for the entire space. I felt like there's so much insensitivity towards the environment, even in India, and there's absolutely no trickle down of conscious thought towards protecting native habitat and biodiversity. So yeah, just adding a bit of context and relating it to your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because I can see that mirror completely. And what I picked up, I think, is an innovative approach that people haven't quite understood, is what have you got there and how could you build with that? Because we see it time and time again. It's like raise the land, and then there's all this fantastic marketing. Oh, you've got some green space. Oh, we've put in water-sensitive urban design. Well, you just concreted over a wetland. And I think that's part of that is the economics of a project, the inflexibility perhaps within systems, and sometimes people don't care. But that's where the systemic changes come in. That's when the future planners of the world are going to actually make a difference by engaging, or whichever built environment profession, start engaging in those conversations a little bit differently. So, yeah, thank you. Oh, I love this room. All those hands go up. This is great. Sydney, I have to bribe them with chocolate. Right, let's go.
Hi, my name is Marinissa. Again, I'd also like to thank you for your lecture. So I come from an economics background. I don't come from a design background. And what I want to understand is your experience of kind of having to navigate this conversation in an era of mass production, capitalism, and affordable housing, right? Because that is the main crux. I think Shreya was talking about why they didn't integrate the environment. It was probably more costly for them to do so, to do that research, to make that extra effort, and it would make the housing more expensive and people not being able to afford the cost and the money that they had put in. So how you have kind of navigated those conversations and how you see that going in the future?
Navigation's an interesting word. So I'll take a broad scale rather than my own experience. So I work with a lot of housing researchers, really great housing researchers. And so the conversations we have within the faculty is about affordability, accessibility, and they find it abhorrent, this opening up of residential subdivisions on the outskirts of Sydney that are very expensive anyway, and without and solely car dependent. So, but what happens is that the conversation of doing things differently should have happened a long time ago, because once those decisions have been made in land release areas, or it's gone. And the other thing about it being these decisions being made lot by lot, if it is actually part of the strategic plan to be able to, help people with design models, that's the other thing. The New South Wales Architects Office is starting to do that about what an affordable home could look like, that developers might, like a pattern book. That's what I was trying to think about pattern books. But the decision of doing things was made a long time ago, like in the 60s, and it's very much economic rationalism that says let the developer do everything. So in some ways, you're sort of powerless, even though it's a planning decision way back then to let this happen. And then the planning process itself is just this push me, pull you between, we've got to save that tree, rather than, listen, that's the wrong design for that house. So we could shift a few things, we might be able to save a few things, but it's really minutiae stuff rather than a bigger picture.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alex, and once again, thank you so much for your speaker series. It was really interesting to learn a lot about politics in Australia, because frankly, I knew that there was parliament, but that's about it. I didn't realize how involved the state politics were, the state level dynamics are in conservation and planning. And clearly you said that there's a lot of inefficiencies at the state level and a lot of different overlap with how to conduct planning and working together. And in the United States, we do have the EPA and a federal level branch to dictate environmental policy, nationwide. But even there in the EPA, who people elect in the EPA and the type of people working in the EPA switches and changes with presidency, who's in the cabinet. My question was, do you think that would really resolve a lot in Australia? Because clearly in the United States, there's a lot of flaws in our system with who's in the EPA, and it very much fluctuates with who's the president and who's in control of Congress.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. We're a democracy too, so therefore senior appointments may not seem as democratic as the community might want. But I think it's in most of I don't know how long, it's not evident of political appointments per se. So the people who are being appointed in these positions can actually, it'd be an appointment or it's through a whole interview recruitment process, and they're specialists in their field. But at the same time, you'll read, that person may have been a member of the Labor Party when they were 15, or they worked with the Prime Minister, on a project. But I don't feel it's a political appointment per se. So, and there's a great deal of transparency about their terms of engagement. And they become part of the public service in that regard. So they're not independent. They're needing to report back to the relevant board of the organisation. Yeah, but not black and white, Alex, I can tell you.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I had a question kind of around, because you said this project, the Fig Tree Hill Development Project, went to public hearing. And so I was just curious about kind of the rhetoric around when it went to public hearing, if the public was supportive, and how the council had ended up supporting it, if they were going against what the public said. Or
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure there's a short film about that very thing, Council was very supportive of the proposal because those things were already happening in the council area. So the process part of the community consultation happens when, after the gateway, once the council and the proponent have done all these reports, and it goes to the state government, and the state government, the Department of Planning goes, okay, you can start, you need to do more work, and then this is how you're going to exhibit everything. So there's that sort of process. But I think that also annoyed the people of Campbelltown who have been lobbying a long time for conservation of the koala colony. So it was happening at a time where there was a big community movement, and after the Black Summer fires, it was that community that really got that parliamentary inquiry happening. So that all happens, but the processes of rezoning and Lend-Lease getting on with clearing, all that still happens. All that still happens. And people were absolutely outraged about it. They just actually want all that development to stop and restore the environment. So, or not stop development. Like, no one's saying we don't want new homes, but it is the amount, the concentration, the density of these homes, and what is being taken away to have a house put in, and then then put a build a green space in there, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Luke Early. I'm a first-year MRP student. I wanted to ask you if you could describe the development approval process in New South Wales, and how it might be contributing to this extremely development positive climate that seems to be happening among local councils. Just for context, obviously in the United States, the development approval process, particularly at the local level, is extremely discretionary and often arbitrary. And a lot of housing advocates have been arguing for more streamlined approaches to how local governments approve development in the interest of more affordable housing. I mean, that's where it's mostly occurring.
Yeah.
But in this situation, it almost feels like potentially a really streamlined approach would not be the best for environmental goals. Not to, again, I'm not trying to pit affordable housing versus development here.
No, but you just can't help but get there, because they're the competing interests. They're put as a competition, and maybe that's what we need to do. How do we actually flip that? So it's actually not a competition, but it's actually good strategic planning. But I love a development assessment question, so thank you for asking. We have in our in New South Wales, from that really thin act that I was mentioning to how big it is, that it's that big if you printed it out, because we were everyone was complaining about red tape. Red tape. Do you know about red tape? It's actually pink. I don't know why they call it red tape. Anyway, so pink tape, because I think from an economic basis, the process of actually doing a merit assessment, really looking at something carefully, takes time, and it takes research before you can make a decision. Not all the time. Not all the time. If you want to, put in an addition out the back of your house and the whole suburb, that's easy peasy, right? But sometimes even that, overshadowing, if you're losing backyard and you have to chop down a tree, there's all sorts of things that go in it. So now we've got a whole suite of different SEPs, if you like, there's different instruments, so there's a whole list of things that you can do without, you just do them, you don't have to tell anyone, know your neighbour. Then you've got exempt development, which you can do things, within sort of a box, very clear. Then you've got compliant development, so you don't get approval, but you have to get someone to check that you've actually done it all the right way. And then you've got local development that needs actually to go to local council. Then you've got state significant development, state infrastructure development. Then there's all these other developments that have all their separate processes. So that's one way to look at it. The other way of looking at it is actually where you happen to be in the metropolitan area, you know. So sometimes that work is about, it's not, well, no, I'm going to come back and think about it in terms of, say, climate change and climate readiness and future. There are other ways of actually looking at established neighbourhoods that aren't really going to change much, and think about how owners can be enabled to get on and make changes to their homes that will actually make them, you know, better to cope with the climate, that they have solar panels, that they can, you know, have batteries, all those sort of things, enabling that to happen. Then the other research I'm doing at the moment actually is in the middle ring suburbs. So Australia, I'm so proud to tell you this, Australia builds on average the largest homes in the world, right? Yeah, so proud, just so proud of it. So what that means is that where, you know, homes were built 60 years ago or whatever, nice little bungalows and everything, now we just want them bigger. And we're not just going up, we're going out. And of course you don't have one car, right? You have 2 cars, maybe 3 for the dog. I don't know, there's a lot of cars. So then the architecture of the home, which might have been, you know, double facing, next thing you know, you've got this huge Italianate thing with, you know, the double garage at the front. So, and then double driveway of concrete. So what we're finding now is that we've lost a lot of trees, and you sort of need trees in Australia, you know, canopy cover, we love canopy cover. Oh, look at your campus, it's amazing, I love it, right? So you need lots of trees, not just trees, trees help other environmental aspects too. But the garden space, the soft landscape is disappearing, right? And so what it means is there's no room for people to actually plant trees either. And the onus is now coming on to local government to provide trees on public land. So we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And it's just anti-climate change. So we're actually, again, enabling unsustainability through there. So to reverse that is very hard, right? You know, so we haven't got our head around that too. But it's very complex decision making in planning. I don't know if I answered your question though. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kripa. Thank you for your talk. So in your timeline, you mentioned that pre-colonization, whether here or in Australia, there were indigenous communities living in harmony with their environment. So I was just wondering, do you know of efforts to integrate indigenous communities into land use planning? And how do you see that like growing moving forward?
Yeah. We're really slow in Australia, but we've really started to understand that maybe people that have lived here for 60,000 years might know a bit more than some of us. And it's been quite fantastic actually starting to work with communities understanding about caring for country. That's the term that we use in Australia from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. I mean, they've actually transformed the country. I think when they turned up, you know, the environment looked completely different because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a fire practice. But, you know, there is no evidence at all in the last 60,000 years that there's been mega fire events as they have now. And so one of the other things that we're trying to convince the bushfire people, the fireys, is actually listen to what the elders have to say about preparing land for summer. And they do what's known as cool burning. And, you know, they just light the grasses around the trees and the koalas go, oh, it's a bit smoky, and they just sort of move up a bit and grasshoppers go away, and there's no death in that, you know. Grasses aren't doing too good, but, you know, there's this whole thing where the animals can actually come, you know, go out and come back in a space. And that's a real political problem we've got at the moment, because if we could learn how to do that, you know, we'd actually help our biodiversity. but also help in terms of protecting, you know, people in cities too, because we're losing, you know, a lot of our towns and the edges of our cities are very, very, very prone. But understanding native vegetation and, you know, I'd been pulling out this persistent plant in my garden, and then I went on a tour at the university, and an Aboriginal woman was talking about the local plants. I went, oh, I've been pulling out the wrong thing. So it's now looking very nice in my garden because I've learnt. And it attracts all the bees and everything, so it's all quite lovely. But there's such racism in such a racist country, Australia. It's going to take a long time for people to actually listen to what First Nations people are saying. But they want to tell us. I don't know how they forgive us, but they really want to tell us, which is great.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming to speak here. My name is Stella. I had two questions that both deal with the actions and attitudes of the residents of the community in terms of the koala colony. So my first question is whether or not there has been any sort of behavioral interventions to have people in the community be more mindful, especially as you mentioned that a lot of koala deaths can be attributed to getting run over by cars or getting killed by dogs or cats. And while there's no official laws in place, I wonder if there was any sort of incentives or signs, for example, to have people more aware of the damages that these could have on the koala community. And my second question is that also oftentimes during policy failure or the absence of policy or legislation to effectively address issues, communities themselves will come up with their own solutions on their own private property in order to solve or help mitigate the issue. And I wondered if there has been any like grassroots or organic movements by people of the community to make like their own private property more habitable to koalas, or maybe like taking any initiatives in their own hands to ensure that the koalas are protected.
Yeah, great questions. And of course, I'll forget the first one, so I'll start with the second one, and then you'll have to remind me of the first one. So there is a big community support for koalas wherever koalas happen to be. Some up in the mid-coast, a community started the Koala Hospital, which is fantastic, and you can, if I had their website, you can donate. No. They started that because animals are being hit, or with dogs, and you can't get in to see the vet. But this is a 24-hour thing, and they're specialists in that, and then they release them. The Campbelltown community, they actually have their own organisation, and they are active lobbyists. Right, so they're really out there, really working hard for the koalas. I'm not sure whether they've got, if any of them are on substantive land holdings. But if you have a look on Google Earth, you'll see that a lot of the properties, around the interface have got, there's pretty good canopy cover there. But they seem to be really politically minded there compared to the mid-coast people who are doing a lot more work with the well-being of koalas, if you like. But if there's an emergency, everyone goes in there. But yeah, and what was your first question?
Yeah, no worries. My first question was whether or not there were any interventions to modify people's behavior to make them more aware.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and I think there could be, things that are put upon communities when they don't realise what the intervention is for. And I was only thinking about that yesterday because last week or the week before I put my signature to an open letter to New South Wales Parliament about changing the speed limits for suburban areas, right? So currently it's 40. Right, so 40 kilometres, or 40 miles, sorry, you can do the conversion, you're all smart, right, 40 kilometres an hour. And when that came in, we were going, oh, it's so slow. But we all got used to that. But a colleague of mine is working, with the Medicine and Health Emergency Services and a few other things that, if you have a little kid, you know, or someone who's older, or your dog, or whoever, and you walk out or you guys, and you walk out in front of a car at 40, you know, you'll get hurt, and little kids get killed at 40. But if you drop it by 10 kilometres an hour, a little kid could get hit and hurt, but they are likely not to die. That 10 kilometres makes a lot of difference. And then I was thinking to myself, because I signed that thing, very happy to sign that thing, and it's gone off, and then, you know, Parliament needs to think about it. And then I was thinking about koalas, because koalas, you know, are little kids. They can be as big as a little, you know, little kid. And I thought, what if that had a benefit? Like if we got to that 30 kilometres in these new communities and people actually stuck to 30 kilometres, maybe that would reduce the risk for koalas in regards to that. So they wouldn't even know that the 30 kilometres was doing something good for koalas. I mean, no one wants to hit a koala, right? And no one's going out trying to hit a koala. But yeah, it could be an, you know, sideways things. But then I think the interventions, which are obvious, which are, you know, you can't have a dog, right? Which is happening up in the mid-north coast. It's about 300 kilometres north of Sydney, right? And that's what the Land and Environment Court has said to this new proposal. Future residents cannot have dogs or cats. And I'm really interested to see what the community is going to say about that. You know, because that's a big deal, right? You can't have them. But if we had been responsible animal owners and kept them indoors, like cats are the worst in Australia. They're an invasive species. They go out and they just slaughter things all night and then come home and they're really cute, right? Cats cannot be let out in our country, yet we've got millions of cats, right? But if we were keeping our dogs in our yard, walking them on the lead, walking your cat on the lead, making sure your cat doesn't get out at night, we wouldn't actually have the problems that we do with loss of biodiversity. But people aren't being responsible, so therefore, and that's the education thing. And even, you know yourself, all these education programs that we have, like do the right thing, put your litter in the bin, or eat an apple and not a donut. You know, we don't always listen to those messages either.
Thank you.
Great question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Keane, and I come from India. I'm sorry, I have too many thoughts in my mind, so I'm just framing them. We come from a third world country. We are still developing. And the mindset while developing a city, if we keep it nature first, it becomes difficult to go back and redo things that we have already lost. So why I say this is, I'm an urban designer, by the way, and I used to work with metros and transit-oriented developments, etc. in the country. To build a metro is to make the city more sustainable. To bring a slum development to a high-rise building and bringing more land for the city is again more sustainable, apparently. But to again have that land, maybe 1% or a 0.5% of a forest has to be cut down. And these forests within the city still have the endangered species like koalas, like cheetahs are endangered, the Bengal tigers are endangered. So when we again look back at our policies and planning, how should be our thought process? What is the middle ground to it? Because to reduce our cars on the street, we have to build the metro. And if we don't have the space, we need to carve down bits and pieces from the greens that are around our cities. So how do we just go around it by saying, oh, we need to put the nature first? Or should we say, we need to do the development to bring back a long-term environmental plan?
Well, I guess it's a combination of things depending on the situation, you know. So I think the first step in our thinking should always be about conserving something, you know. Try and protect what you've got, right? And there's different ways of doing that too. It's not always about making something a national park or a reserve that says, right, you're safe for life, right? That's not necessary. You know, what are the environmental assets there that you can integrate into design? A bit hard with a big wild cat though. They have a particular need. So that would be a very important conversation to be having about, you know, maybe trying to save those. There might be a need for that. The next thing for conservation is actually restoring. So, you know, if you've got degraded environment, that could be integrated into your design with new communities and the metro, etc. You can use your sense of design about bring that in as part of, you know, your renaturing, and things that are local to the area start flourishing, right? And people could live with those. And the space doesn't always need to be on the ground either. It could be, you know, in different ways. And then you probably get to a point where everything is gone and you're putting in all this new stuff, then really you've got a blank canvas. And to understand what your ecosystem is and what, you know, the local conditions are, what would be supported by the local, you know, conditions, and factor that into the design of what you're doing. So it's never one answer, it's a combination of all those things. And that's why urban designers are incredibly important. No one understands how important urban designers are, actually. It's true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yu Chenxie, and I want to know something about how those laws and regulations were conducted into the practice level, because from my own experience, the few projects about reservations that I did, no matter how well or how good intention those regulations are, eventually those results of the project will depend on the people who in charge of it, especially in the administration level. So it depends on their determination or whether they want to take the risk. So my question is there something we can do from the law or legislative level that we can actually do to guide the actual practice?
For the practice of building?
Yeah, the actual practice of building landscapes or those urban areas.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a perennial question too, isn't it? Because you are reliant on other people to rebuild your house, for example. And so there are things that we can do by setting standards about the right materials you might make, or there's good urban design principles in terms of solar orientation and overshadowing and all those sort of things. But what I've noticed is that there is less and less oversight on the quality of these things, or even if you've given approval and you have a list of conditions, who is actually checking that those things have been done? Who's checking that they've been done the right way? So what I think is happening at the moment, we've got no performance measurement. Right? We're not actually taking account of that. We're not auditing the quality to make sure everything is going as it should be. But yes, it's almost like a buyer beware proposition when you're trying to do something, even at the home, about what quality of materials you might have, the impact of those in terms of waste, if it's sustainable. There's many different things that we can't control, and we sort of have to rely on the government as well as the industry to do that, but I don't think we're, as consumers, we're really across that.
Hello, thank you for coming to Cornell. My name is Jose Rodriguez. I come from Bogota, Colombia. The past few years I worked in urban development in Bogota. It's a really big city in terms of population, 10 million people, lots of biodiversity. And I'm gonna ask you a question regarding civil society organizations and what role do they play in this koala problematic, and also in general in protecting endangered species. Because for us, the urban expansion has been limited by these civil society organizations because they have a big impact in policy making.
Yeah, right.
And for example, we have a lot of biodiversity in terms of birds also, and a species called northern pudu, which is the smallest species of deer, and is present in these wetlands that the civil society organizations try to protect. So thinking widely and in general, do you think that the role that these organizations have is important in planning and urban development?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I think those organisations, the NGOs, the community groups can get so much done that governments cannot, the decision makers cannot. And sometimes it's actually the motivation from the people who appreciate the values and actually do all the hard work that actually supports the city to support different biodiversity. And if we didn't have the community engaged in those ways, I think we'd be we'd be poorer for it within our own cities.
First of all, I want to point out that the koala is a charismatic species, and I can imagine koala-safe development, koala-safe corridors, and I think but you're bringing to light the importance of thinking of the koala and its habitat and a wider ecology. So thank you for opening this window onto Australian environmental policy, urban development. I want to encourage everyone in the audience to continue to learn about Australian environmental legislation. It has a fascinating history of urban protest that has produced important preserved landscapes. Its history of green bans is something that you'll want to look up or maybe ask about, where radical labor unions stopped construction, and that resulted in environmental and preservation legislation that has had a long-term impact. And so I'd like to conclude this and encourage everyone to come to the talk back. I'm not quite sure which room it's in. 105. And please join me again in thanking Dr. Keane for joining us and leading such a stimulating presentation.